So she must have, her father must have been Magnus something, but I don't know exactly what that was.
My dad's parents were, well, my grandfather, Powelson, Ellis Bertrand Powelson, he was born in Goshen, Utah. His parents, his dad was born in Denmark, and his mother was born, I don't know, but she came from Wales.
Okay, so Ellis Bertrand Powelson was married to whom?
Ruth Roby Alexander.
Okay.
And
And so Ellis Bertrand Powelson's parents were named what?
Soren Paulson.
Spell it.
Well,
P-A-U-L.
P-A-U-L-S-O-N.
Or S-E-N.
Or S-E-N, I'm not sure which.
Okay, and
But
what was
anyway,
what
it
was her,
anglicized to Powelson.
okay, what was her name then?
Sarah Jane Thomas.
Sarah Jane Thomas.
And she was...
Marguerite.
No,
Oh, Sarah Jane Thomas.
Sarah Jane Thomas, and her family was from Wales. She was a little short, fat lady, the pictures that I've seen of her.
Are these all people who migrated because of the gospel?
Yes.
Did anyone on either side come over that was not coming for the gospel?
No,
That was what brought everyone here.
Yeah, that's about right.
except on my dad's side, yes.
Colleen, who was the one that died over back in Kansas City?
Oh, Dorothea, but
Mickle's daughter.
Mickle's daughter. But she
Wasn't
was
she-
married to Mads Paulson, who anglicized to Powelson.
Tell about the story time we went back there to visit that gravesite.
The
First,
story he's talking...
just real quick before we go to that, what was the name of so that was your father's
Dad's.
side?
On my dad's side, and it was his grandparents. Now, my grandmother, Ruth Roby Alexander, she was born in Midway, Utah. When she was not quite a teenager, I think she was 12, in 1900, it was the very last colonization that the church did. They went up to Wyoming to colonize up there, and Bella, and anyway, she was 12 years old, went to the Bighorn Basin. They were happily living a life in Midway, Utah. Her dad was a silver miner in Park City, and he could see everyone around him dying. His name was Adelbert Alexander, and he said, I think I'm going to go to the Bighorn Basin because if I stay here, I'm going to die like everyone else around me because of black lung. And so he would walk from Midway to Park City every day and back again.
17 miles
Yeah,
each direction.
Each
In the
direction.
snow.
In the snow, uphill both ways probably.
No, it is 17 miles, as I drove it every day to work.
It's 17 miles, and he would walk it. And anyway, he in the spring of the year, he and his teenage son, they had 150 head of cattle, horses, and other animals that they herded bareback the 500 miles up to the Bighorn Basin. And he rode it horseback, he and his son, herding these cattle up there. Then he sent for his family, and they went partway by train and came into the Bighorn Basin.
Where did they meet him?
They met him in Bridger, Montana.
So the train only went to Bridger, Montana, and then they had to go in by horse from there.
And there were no cars or anything like that, so they were with horse and buggy. And so my grandmother and grandfather,
Named?
Ellis Powelson and Ruth Roby Alexander, the Ellis of this, he was, I believe, 17 years old, and he was a stowaway on a train that went to Bridger, Montana, and he and his uncle. And then they got off the train in Bridger and went with a horse and buggy. Someone met them, and they went horse and buggy down to the Bighorn Basin, and that's where they homesteaded.
Who was the uncle?
The uncle was Emmanuel Thomas. It was his mother's brother who he went with. So he worked for several years. He helped build a railroad. He helped build a dam. He
Which dam was it?
the Buffalo Bill Dam, and another one up in Montana.
So that's up by Cody, Wyoming?
And anyway, down the road a few years, my grandmother was cooking for the people working on the railroad, and they met, and they went to Salt Lake and got married in the temple.
This is Ruth Roby Alexander.
Ruth Roby Alexander and Alice Bertram Powelson. They eventually had 8 children, 6 girls, 2 boys, my dad being one of the sons.
And what were their names in chronological order?
Edith, Bertrand, Clifford, Stella Louise, Clara, Gladys, let's see, Vera, and Doris.
And did all their children live to adulthood?
All of their children lived to adulthood, and all of them.
Edith died.
Edith died at age 23, and she was pregnant. She was married and pregnant with her first baby, and she got some kind of a really bad infection in her bowel, and the infection killed her, and she died. And she was just a lovely, lovely person. The family was a very, very handsome, beautiful family. They were good-looking people. My grandfather was probably only about 5'8", and so was my grandmother, about 5'8". And so my grandmother always wore heels, so she always looked like she was taller than my grandpa. He lived to be, I believe it was 83 years old, and she was 93 when they lived that long. Good pioneer stock. But they lived in the Bighorn Basin all those years, and my grandfather had land across the Shoshone River from the town of Byron, where they eventually moved to, but they helped colonize that whole area. They did it all. They helped build the roads. They helped build the canal. They did it all. And
Colleen, what kind of a home did your dad grow up in?
my dad was born in a log cabin in Byron, and he lived in a log cabin across the river with these 6 sisters and 1 brother and mother and dad in probably a 3-room house, 3-room log cabin. They hauled their water from the river. They had no electricity.
Wood and coal.
And they burned wood and coal, and then they had been there for probably maybe 20 years, and a gas well was found.
Why didn't they sell out and go home, go back to Byron? Was there a reason? Did an apostle say anything to them?
Well, just a minute. So anyway, the way they got heat to that house from then on, the company said to my grandfather, if you'll watch this gas well that we have, we will let you take a pipe straight from the well to your house, and you can have a stove. And of course that heated the house. And the way they slept, if the bed was like this, the children slept in the bed like this. Sideways. And then they had wires across the room, and they would hang sheets between the girls' bedroom, the boys' bedroom, the mother and dad's bedroom. And then in the daytime, they'd push the sheets back.
They were all in the same room, but they had...
Yeah, they would all be in the same room, but they would be separated by sheets. And Dad would always say it was a little bit crowded. There's no question it was a little bit crowded, but they all got along.
And they eventually moved.
Then eventually moved into Byron, which was on the north side of the Shoshone River. And at the time that I grew up, the town had about 300 people in it.
Why did they choose Byron?
Because that's where they colonized.
But
And-
how are they asked to go to Byron?
It was almost by choice. It was like I say, the church had finished colonizing, and there was Buffalo Bill came to the state of Wyoming and said, we want your Mormon people to go up to the Bighorn Basin and colonize. And they said, well, we're finished colonizing, we're not doing anymore. And he said, yes, but you've got to see this land. So the church sent several of the apostles up there, and they said, well, let's do one more colonization. So they put out the word that they were going to do one more colonization, and there were people like the Adelbert Alexander, who was going to die in the silver mines, and he says, I'll go, and other people said, I'll go.
Those people
And-
that said I will go were people that were struggling on the property that they
That they
currently
had, and so a number of them went up there, and
$500.
500 went up, and they were assigned to 4 different towns.
What
And
were they?
the towns were Burlington, Lovell, Cowley, and Byron, Wyoming. And the 3 towns, Lovell, Cowley, and Byron, are just a few miles from each other. Burlington was a ways away. But at that point, they started farms and living that kind of a life. They built schools. They built a rock church in Byron. They built a schoolhouse that was called the Bighorn Academy, and that was 8 miles away. And so they took a horse and buggy and hauled the kids over to that school until a school in town got built.
What did Apostle Woodruff tell
And
people in Byron?
Apostle Woodruff came a few years later.
This is Wilford Woodruff?
Wilford Woodruff's son, and he was in his 30s. He was a very young apostle, and he stood on a piece of property and he said, "Don't sell your property."
Was this in Byron?
It was in Byron. He said, "Don't sell your property. There's untold riches are on this property." Well, my great-grandfather, in drawing for the homestead, had drawn a swamp. And he traded the swamp for a wagon basket. The wagon box, just the box, not even the whole wagon. And then my grandfather, Ellis, he drew land on the south side of the Shoshone River, and that's why they had the log cabin and the land that he was farming there. It was hard farming because it was sand, but he stayed there because don't sell your property. Eventually, oil was discovered, and my great-grandfather, the land that was the swamp, was the center of the oil field, and he did not get one dime. My grandfather, who stayed on that sandy soil, eventually had sold the mineral rights to some of it, but he eventually had 6 oil wells on that property.
Did he make any money off of it?
He owned 3 of the oil wells on the property, and that was in the 30s, and it's now in 2012, and now that Mother and Dad are gone, Doug and I are still receiving money, oil checks from that property. And how many years would that be? 70, 80 years?
But it moved that whole
82
town
years.
away from being just barely surviving to being people, many of them of great wealth.
And my grandparents were one of those families that really profited from having homesteaded and stayed on that land. And Apostle Woodruff's prophecy that there were untold riches. So,
Who was the man that got the piece of land that he traded out with your great-grandfather?
it was the oil company, Ohio Oil Company.
And how much oil was there?
Oh, it is unreal. There's
Millions?
millions millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of oil on that property.
Colleen, tell the story of Dorothea Michel's daughter.
Okay, so Ellis Bertram Powelson had, his mother was named, no, his father was named Cern. His father was named Mads, and his wife was named Dorothea Michelson.
Matt's wife?
Mad's wife, Mad Polson's wife, Dorothea Michelson,
Or Michel's daughter.
or Michel's daughter. They lived in Denmark, and didn't I tell this story
Yes.
of how they came? Okay, so anyway, they lived in Vejle, Denmark, and
V-E-J-L-E.
V-E-L,
No, V-E-J-L-E.
V-E-J-L-E. Anyway, they lived in Denmark, and the missionaries had taught the gospel in Vejle, and Dorothea was totally converted. Mads was semi-converted, and everyone in the area wanted to come to America. So they were baptized, and they came as far as London, and it was in the middle of the winter, and there was a terrible sickness, and so they all had, no, it was not cholera, and they had to stay over there until they got better. So they stayed in London, and those that got better were able to get on the ship that sailed first part of January. That ship came to New Orleans, and they disembarked in New Orleans, and of course they're on the ship for a long time, and their resistance, half of those would be sick, and their resistance would be bad. Mads and Dorothea had a 2-year-old son named Cern, S-O-R-E-N, and Dorothea got sick.
They went up the Mississippi River.
Yes, but Dorothea got sick in New Orleans, and on the way up the Mississippi River, she died in what is now Kansas City, Missouri, and she was buried there under what is known as a railroad station. Today it's a mall,
The Union Pacific.
the Union Pacific Railroad Station.
And today it's a mall?
Today the railroad station has been turned into a mall. And then he came on,
So
Matt's
she died.
in Kansas City on the way to Utah with all.
At the
nuns.
railroad station? Or in
well,
the location where a railroad station now stands and is now a mall?
Yeah, and that's where she was buried, in the
Okay.
place where the railroad station stands. And I don't know that she was ever excavated, moved or anything. I think they probably just buried on top of her. But Mads and his son Cern went on to Utah, and he lived there for a period of time and remarried. Then he that didn't really work out, and he went back to Denmark, and
Joined the Josephites.
he joined the Josephites, and he finally decided that was not a good thing to have done, so he dropped that and came back to Utah
A little lost.
and
after that.
lived the rest of his life in Goshen. And
Was he active in the church?
semi, but never really got completely into the church. His son married Sarah Jane Thomas, who was a very, very faithful member of the church, and they had a son named Ellis.
Well,
And that's,
this is Soren Powelson married Sarah Jane Thomas,
yes,
and he was active in the church.
yes, but not totally engrossed in the church like she was.
Mhm.
But he was a good man. But they had a son named Ellis, and that's who the Ellis Powelson is. That was my grandfather. Now that being said,
No one ever visited the gravesite of Dorothea.
of Dorothea. So a few years ago, Dad and I, Clark and I, we were going to go buy a car in Kansas City, and we decided that we would go to that railroad station. There was no place to park, and Dad saw a couple of guys, black guys that were security guards at the front door, and he says, will you watch my car while my wife goes in and explain the story? And I went in and came out and got Dad, and we went in together, and it was just as if she was between us, putting her arms around us, saying, thanks for coming and honoring me. Because it was literally just a very, very, very spiritual experience that she was appreciating the fact that we knew who she was and that we loved her enough to stop by.
Let me add just a little bit. We could not find a parking spot, so I let Colleen out and went around while Colleen was in the building. And then I saw those two policemen, and I told them, my wife is in there honoring her great-grandmother that
It's buried
underneath this station. And I said,
Bella.
and they said, well, sir, you go
She's
ahead
okay.
and walk in, and we'll watch your car for you. Because they could feel the spirit. So I walked in, and Colleen was just standing there. And as we were standing there, we both started crying and holding on to each other, because we could literally feel Dorothea right there with us. And Colleen said she is grateful that we remembered her.
Yeah.
We're the first relatives ever to go back to do that. And then tell them about us continuing on the trip up to Slingerville.
So then we decided that we'd go up to Slingerville,
Wisconsin?
Wisconsin, where John Peter Henry was born, and also where Jacob Henry first came into the country. And Jacob Henry, a little story on him is, when he came into the country, we're talking about the 1800s, and he couldn't even sign his name. And he signed his name on his citizenship with an X that was witnessed, and then we saw another X on a piece of property that he owned, that he had signed his name with an X. Good man, but kind of interesting, that he was that way. Now, those two, Jacob Henry and Barbara Teresa Fries Henry, they both spoke German to each other all the time.
So his name is Jacob Heinrich.
Heinrich.
Now, was Jacob Heinrich and Barbara Fries, were they the first ones to join the church on that part of your family line?
No, mother was.
Okay.
Now tell them about
They were Catholic.
how we found your relatives. Your mom said when
Oh,
your
so
mom said, don't forget the Frises.
yeah, we were going up to see this Slingerville to see where they were from, and we would ask people. We looked in the phone books and we asked people, do you know any Gayharts, any Henrys? No. Everyone was no. And the night before I got up there, I called Mother to see how she was doing. She was living in our house, and I told her that we were going up there, and she says, well, don't forget the Frises. And so that day, do you know any Henrys? Do you know any Gayharts? And all of a sudden, we saw a little man.
It was Sunday morning.
It was Sunday morning, no one on the street, and it's a small place. And we had gone to the cemetery, and we had walked through the whole cemetery
We found one.
and found one headstone
No name on it.
that all it had on it was just Fries, and it had been knocked over. And we were discouraged, really. And so we were driving down through Main Street there, and we passed a man on the street, and I said, turn around, which is quite unlike me. But I said, turn around and go back, and let's talk to that man. And so we did, and we said, do you know any Gayharts? No. Do you know any Henrys? Don't forget the Frises, I thought. And so I said, do you know any Frises? And he says, My best friend is a priest and he lives just around the corner.
Richard Freese.
And his name was Richard Freese, and we went over to his house, knocked on the door, and I went in and talked to them and visited with them. They were descendants of the Barbara Freese, one of the siblings, and of who were the, well, Barbara Teresa Freese, and one of the siblings. He was a descendant of one of the siblings. And anyway,
So he was a descendant of Barbara Freese or a
a sibling of Barbara Freese.
sibling of Barbara Freese?
Which means his grandfather and our great grandfather and my great grandfather would be the same person. So anyway,
Second cousins?
probably fourth.
Fourth cousins.
But anyway, I said to them finally, and it was just by chance.
While she was in there was 5 or 6 old guys, older than I am, that came out. And I told them I was a Mormon. They saw the Utah license plates, and they were very intrigued by that. And they asked me about polygamy and whether I had more wives. You know, they didn't know anything about the church. And so we were a real curiosity. So I gathered this group around me and I was talking to them. And Colleen went in, had never met these people, but she introduced herself and they knew instantly who she was. And she spent 45 minutes.
Yeah, they knew instantly the connection. And finally, I said to them, "Do you have any genealogy?" And they said, the woman jumped up out of her chair and she says, "Yes, I do." She says, I have a lot on the Freese line." And she,
85 pages.
it's something, several pages, a lot of pages. And so I thought to myself, now how am I going to get these people to allow me to take this genealogy and copy it? And so they had an 18-year-old grandson there, and I said, "Would you allow us to take your 18-year-old grandson down and have this copied off?"
There's only one copy machine in the town,
And
and it had just been fixed.
it had been fixed the day before, the only copy machine in town.
And what town was this in? Slingerville?
Slingerville. And so they said, "If you've come this far, you just take the genealogy. We know you'll come back." And so we did. We took it down and the copy machine had just barely been fixed and brought back. And they copied it off and I took it back to them and bid them farewell and away we went. And that's our next project is the.
I was gonna say, can you do the temple work on that?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah.
We have 9 generations back on the Freese line, which is good.
Well, interestingly enough, my mother got a call from a man who was a Freese from Florida before she died, and he said, I have been in the church's website. He says, "I'm not Mormon, but I've been in the church's website, and I have put some stuff in it." And that's probably where that came from. So, anyway, that's
That was, in our opinion, that was a miraculous thing.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
well, to begin with, it was a miraculous thing because we had a choice between either going to Nauvoo, which would have been a very fun thing to have done, or go up to Slingerville, and we took Slingerville. And we're glad that we did,
And
because
was-
those people are dead now.
And we were right on that lonely street in the downtown part of town, and not another soul was around except that one man. And Richard Freese was his best friend. And he was within about a block and a half of where we were at.
Oh, another thing there, and so I said to this couple in this house, I said, where are they buried? And they said, well, someone had gone in and knocked that headstone over. But he says, all of the Freeses are buried behind the Catholic Church. And so we went up to the cemetery and
Got all
took
kinds of
pictures.
photographs of
Took pictures of all their headstones. And now, of course, we have to place them with the papers that they gave us, but that's kind
the agenda?
Well,
On the first page.
What number are we on?
Oh, we haven't done that.
They ask if I'm like my grandparents in any way, and I remember when I was 9 years old, my grandfather, Wilford Woodruff, became very ill. And I was out in front of the store about 3 blocks from our house down west of, on 3rd South where we lived. And I can remember standing out in on the sidewalk as an ambulance, a green ambulance came by, and that was my grandpa in there. And he died a few days later. So I didn't get much information. I don't know much about my grandpa, except I knew he loved me. And when I was little, I would get the croup, and I'd cough, and it'd sound like I was barking like a dog. And I can remember standing on a chair while my grandma boiled this foul-smelling stuff and made a cone so the steam would come up, and I would breathe that so that I wouldn't bark when I coughed. But my grandpa had cows. He milked his own cows. He had sheep. He had pigs, and he had chickens. And then he had a fruit orchard with some of the best apples, golden delicious, red delicious, Roman apples, and others that we just loved. And he ran a very good farm. He had 3 horses. One was named Mac, the other was named Babe, and the other name was Puss. And he'd put us kids on the backs of them, and we could ride around when he was cutting hay or harrowing or something like that. We loved those horses. And they had a dog named Torch, and they always ate well. They had a big mulberry tree out in the backyard. They didn't have a lot of water. They irrigated, but they didn't have a lot of water for the house. It came from a well. And so they didn't have any grass, but they had a nice